Have you ever been in a meeting where a single number on a spreadsheet completely dictated the future of a project? Or, a company, or maybe even your own job?
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time.
Right. You're just sitting there looking at a specific cell on a screen, and it somehow carries this weight of ultimate authority in the room?
Yeah, we treat these numbers as if they're just neutral measurements of reality, like a thermometer.
Exactly. But what if that number is actually, well, a mathematical engine? One that's silently reshaping your reality and foreclosing all other possible futures?
That is the big question. And it requires a really fundamental shift in how we perceive organizational life. I mean, we're so accustomed to thinking of financial models as tools that serve human decision-making,
Right. Tools we use to make our lives easier.
Exactly. We rarely pause to consider how we might actually be serving the models, or how they might be physically rewiring our perception of the world around us.
Well, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, our mission is to unpack a paper by Hisataka Takasugi from the Takasugi Research Institute, and it's titled DCF as Must-Mode Ontology.
It's a fascinating piece of work.
It really is. We are basically looking at this wild intersection of corporate finance, philosophy, and human psychology.
Yeah, the central thesis is really provocative. Takasugi argues that a standard financial formula discounted cash flow, or DCF, has inadvertently evolved into a psychological prison for, well, millions of professionals.
Literal prison made of math.
Basically, yeah. He says it generates this systemic organizational anxiety and actively dismantles our capacity to imagine alternative futures.
Okay, let's unpack this. We should probably start by looking at the instrument itself, right? Because we all know the basic premise of the time value of money, like $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow.
Right, that's just basic finance 101.
Yeah, but Takasugi points out that when institutions formalize this into a rigid discounted cash flow model, they aren't just pricing risk, they are enforcing a highly specific temporal worldview.
And that is the crucial distinction he makes right out of the gate. To analyze the philosophical impact of DCF, we have to look closely at its mechanics.
Not just as a calculator thing.
Right, not just as a financial calculation, but as an interpretive lens. So discounted cash flow analysis attempts to answer what a business or a project is actually worth right now in the present moment.
Okay, so how does he explain it in the paper?
Well, Takasugi uses this very grounded analogy of evaluating a small coffee shop.
Oh, I love a good coffee shop analogy.
It makes it so much easier to grasp. So if you are considering buying this coffee shop, you naturally project its future cash generation, right? Let's just assume it reliably produces 10 million yen annually.
Okay, 10 million yen a year, and if you project that out for a decade, basic arithmetic gives you 100 million yen.
Exactly.
But obviously, no buyer in the real world values the business at exactly 100 million yen today because, well, that ignores the opportunity cost of capital and just the inherent risk of time passing.
Right. Which brings us to the formal mathematical structure of the DCF itself. It calculates the present-day equivalent of those future earnings by discounting each future payment.
Shrinking them down, basically.
Yeah, shrinking them. The objective is to arrive at the net present value, or NPV. That's a single metric representing the totality of all those future earnings, but valued today.
Okay, and to get that magical NPV number, the model needs 3 distinct ingredients, right?
Yes, the 3 main inputs. First, you have the free cash flows.
Which is just the cash you expect to make over a set time.
Right, the projected earnings over a specific forecast horizon, usually like 5 to 10 years. Second, you have the discount rate.
That's the percentage by which you shrink the future money.
Exactly, to account for time and risk. But the third input...
Yeah, the third input is where the math starts to get almost metaphysical.
It really does. It's called the terminal value.
Because the coffee shop doesn't just spontaneously combust in year 11, right?
Hopefully not. So the model demands an estimation of all cash flows beyond that 5 or 10-year forecast horizon, stretching out into literal infinity.
Infinity? Just wrapping your head around projecting cash flows to the end of time is wild.
And the scale of that third input is often the most overlooked aspect of standard corporate valuation.
Wait, how much of the final number does this infinity guess actually make up?
In applied finance, terminal value routinely accounts for 60 to 80% of a company's total estimated value within these models.
Wait, really? 60 to 80%?
Yes, the vast majority of the value.
Let me just map this out, because that percentage is insane. We are saying that when multinational corporations are negotiating, like massive mergers, or a board is doing a huge strategic pivot, The vast majority of the quote-unquote value anchoring that massive decision is derived from a mathematical assumption about what happens from year 11 until the literal end of time.
That is exactly what happens.
But how do analysts even do that? They try to stabilize that infinity using something like the Gordon growth model, right?
Right. They assume the cash flows will just grow at a stable perpetual rate forever.
Just a smooth line going up forever.
They do. And the sensitivity of that assumption is just staggering. I mean, if you adjust the perpetual growth rate in a Gordon growth calculation by just 0.5 percentage point.
0.5%.
Yeah, just 0.5%. It can swing the valuation by billions of dollars.
Billions. From a tiny tweak to an assumption about infinity.
Exactly. And yet, DCF is ubiquitous. It is the bedrock methodology taught at Wharton, INSEAD, Harvard Business School.
It's everywhere.
Ever since John Burr Williams published The Theory of Investment Value back in 1938, DCF has just become the undisputed language of corporate value creation.
So treating this DCF output as absolute truth feels, it's akin to looking at a 10-day weather forecast, right?
That's a good way to look at it.
And instead of treating it as a rough probabilistic model, you literally board up your windows and cancel your entire life because the app predicted rain next Thursday.
Yeah, that's spot on. Now, what's fascinating here is Takasugi is careful to note that the mathematics of DCF are not inherently flawed.
Right, the math itself isn't evil.
No. And the concept of forecasting isn't useless. As a theoretical framework, it's actually exceptionally elegant.
So where does it go wrong?
Well, the primary inquiry of his paper is what happens to individuals and the organizations they work in when the output of this highly sensitive, highly speculative calculation stops being seen as an estimate.
When it becomes gospel.
Exactly. The danger emerges when the model transitions from a descriptive tool to a prescriptive reality.
Okay, so if we follow that logic, the question is really about institutional mutation. Like, how does a widespread, heavily caveated financial framework transform into this unquestioned dictator of reality?
Takasugi addresses this through what he calls the three-layer framework. It maps the structural environment where DCF operates.
Okay, let's break down these layers.
So the foundational layer, layer 1, is capitalism. But he doesn't treat capitalism just as an economic system of supply and demand. He defines it as an ontological environment.
Ontology. That's a heavy word. Elevating the conversation from economics to, the fundamental nature of being.
Yes, exactly. An ontological environment dictates what is considered real, meaningful, and legitimate within a given space.
So in this corporate context, the capitalist environment structurally mandates that value is defined as exchangeable.
Right.
And time is defined as a resource that can be discounted.
Spot on. It acts as the atmosphere condition of the corporate world. You don't consciously adopt these definitions. You just operate within them as given truths. You breathe the air.
Okay, so that leads us to layer 2, which is corporate finance.
Right. Takasugi frames layer 2 as the operational logic. It functions as the translation layer.
Translation layer, like converting the big philosophy into actual rules.
Exactly. It converts the abstract axioms of capitalism into procedural directives. It basically tells you how to navigate that ontological environment we just talked about.
Which means layer 3 has to be the mechanism of execution. So if capitalism is the environment and corporate finance is the logic, DCF is the actual tool.
Yes. Takasugi specifically designates DCF as the ontological compression mechanism.
Ontological compression mechanism. That is a mouthful.
It is, but it makes sense when you think about it. It effectively takes this sprawling, complex belief system of capitalism and compresses it into a single functional mathematical equation.
Okay, I see that. But the core of his unified theory rests on identifying two distinct modes of human orientation toward these models, right? Want mode and must mode.
Yes, the unified theory lens. This is where it gets really interesting.
If I'm interpreting his terminology correctly, want mode implies a degree of provisionality, like it's a pluralistic orientation.
Right. In want mode, you construct a model, you recognize it as a construct, and you remain open to multiple potential futures.
So your professional identity isn't totally tied to a single number on a screen.
Exactly. Must mode, conversely, is the total foreclosure of that openness. The possibility space collapses into a single required trajectory.
And any deviation from that trajectory becomes this massive existential threat.
You nailed it. And that maps perfectly to the psychological shift practitioners actually undergo. Takasugi outlines this transition through the 6 stages of ontological corruption.
6 stages of corruption. Sounds ominous.
Well, when John Burr Williams first proposed the framework in the 1930s, It existed entirely in want mode.
It was just a theory to explore.
Right, an intellectual exploration. But as the model progresses through these stages of corruption, it gets embedded in institutional infrastructure.
Like MBA programs.
MBA programs, investment banking protocols, regulatory compliance standards, all of it.
And as it does that, the stakes fundamentally change, don't they? It's no longer just an intellectual exercise in a classroom.
No, not at all. A practitioner's compensation, their promotion trajectory, their perceived competence, it all becomes completely dependent on their fluency with this specific mathematical compression mechanism.
And because of those institutional stakes, alternative ways of valuing things like, I don't know, real options valuation or qualitative stakeholder analysis, they get systematically pushed out.
Marginalized, yeah. And not because they lack mathematical rigor, but simply because they fail to produce the singular authoritative number that the institutional machine needs to keep running.
They don't spit out the one magic number.
Exactly. And this all culminates in the final stage, which Takasugi calls ontological sedimentation.
Sedimentation, like hardening into rock.
That's the perfect image. The constructed nature of the model just becomes invisible.
Wait, meaning the analyst forgets they are the author of the assumptions?
Yes. They begin to experience the output of the spreadsheet as an independent, pre-existing fact that they have merely uncovered, like they dug it up out of the ground.
They internalize it so much that it stops being a tool they use and becomes the actual medium through which they see reality. The spreadsheet becomes the eyeball.
That is a great way to put it.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and I have to push back a little on the timeline of that sedimentation, because it requires a massive suspension of disbelief from highly educated professionals.
How so?
Well, we are talking about analysts and executives who literally built the Excel files, right? They manually typed in the 8% discount rate instead of a 9% discount rate. They actively chose the terminal growth rate.
Right, their fingerprints are all over.
Yeah. So how does the author of a fiction forget that they wrote the story? How does someone not realize they're trapped by their own math?
It's a great question. And it happens through the sheer force of institutional performance.
Institutional performance.
Think about it. If your entire professional standing relies on projecting absolute certainty to a board of directors, you cannot present a DCF model and caveat it by saying, hey guys, this is a highly speculative narrative I constructed about the next decade.
Right, you'd get laughed out of the boardroom or fired.
Exactly. You are required to present it as a definitive roadmap. So the sociological phenomenon here is that performing absolute certainty repeatedly, day after day, eventually overrides your conscious awareness of the model's fragility.
So the external demand for a single number eventually rewires your internal perception. Fake it till you make it, but in a bad way.
Basically, yes. The institutional environment demands certainty. The practitioner performs certainty to survive, and eventually that performance calcifies into genuine belief.
Okay, so if that's the sociological mechanism, let's look under the hood at the mathematical mechanism. How exactly does the internal structure of the DCF formula physically close off our perception of alternative futures?
Takasugi deconstructs this through what he calls the 4 pillars of ontological foreclosure.
The 4 pillars, let's go through them. What's the first one?
The first pillar is the foreclosure of scenario plurality. The mechanical structure of DCF requires the analyst to select a single deterministic set of projected cash flows. You must input one specific growth rate, one specific discount rate, to generate one single net present value.
So by forcing a convergence on one number, the model takes a wide array of genuinely possible futures and just crushes them down.
It collapses them. In the context of a resource allocation meeting, alternative futures don't just appear less likely. They literally cease to exist in the conversation. They're structurally erased.
Wow. Okay, so if the first pillar erases alternative futures, it seems like the second pillar would have to deal with how the model treats the passage of time itself.
You're exactly right.
Because if I am mathematically mandated to heavily discount the future, I am structurally enforcing a philosophy where only the immediate present actually matters.
Yes, and Takasugi identifies that exact dynamic as the second pillar, privileging the present. The mechanical act of exponential discounting enforces a temporal ontology, where the present moment is given ultimate reality and the future is progressively delegitimized.
Let's put some real numbers to that compounding mechanism, because I think people don't realize how brutal it actually is for long-term planning.
Please do.
Let's say we are looking at a 12% discount rate, which is fairly standard for a corporate project with, moderate risk. If an R&D initiative is expected to generate $1 million in year 2, that million is valued at roughly $800,000 today.
Right. a reasonable haircut for 2 years of waiting.
Yeah, totally reasonable. But if we are looking at a transformative long-term project, say, a massive breakthrough in material science that won't see commercialization for 15 years, that exact same $1 million in year 15 is mathematically valued at less than $183,000 today.
That's astonishing when you lay it out like that.
It shrinks to nothing. The compounding exponent in the denominator of the formula acts as a literal black hole for long-term innovation.
It mathematically penalizes foresight. And that leads directly into the third pillar. Risk as the price of deviation.
Risk as deviation.
Yeah. In a healthy, pluralistic environment, risk is often synonymous with opportunity, right? With innovation.
No risk, no reward.
Exactly. But within the strictures of DCF, risk is simply uncertainty that is mathematically punished through an elevated discount rate.
So if a project is highly innovative and therefore difficult to predict, it automatically gets slapped with a higher discount rate,
which drives its present value down to basically zero. In a must-mode ontology, uncertainty is not a space for exploration. It's an ontological deviation that the math actively seeks to neutralize.
It demands total predictability. And if a project cannot offer that predictability, the math just declares it inherently worthless.
Precisely.
Which brings us back to the most glaring contradiction in the whole model, the fourth pillar. Because if the model hates uncertainty so much, how does it justify the terminal value calculation? You know, the part where it requires predicting cash flows out to infinity.
It is the ultimate contradiction. Takasugi frames this fourth pillar as epistemic overreach. It represents the ultimate hypocrisy of the must-mode framework. We operate in an environment governed by what economists classify as Nietzschean uncertainty.
Right, Frank Knight's concept of unquantifiable risk.
Exactly.
Just to clarify for everyone, it's the difference between knowing the odds of drawing a specific card from a standard deck versus walking into a casino where you don't know what games are being played, what the rules are, or like if the building is about to catch fire.
That's a perfect summary. The future of human civilization over the next 50 years is pure Nietzschean uncertainty.
And yet the mechanical requirements of the DCF model compel the analyst to assign a precise numerical value to cash flows extending into that exact, fundamentally unknowable infinity.
It is an act of epistemic arrogance enforced by mathematical necessity.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back on this framing of epistemic overreach, because it kind of risks characterizing financial analysts as these megalomaniacs trying to play God with numbers.
I can see how it sounds that way.
But wait, isn't estimating terminal value really just practical math? I mean, businesses have to plan for the long haul. They have to account for the fact that their brand and operations will have some residual value beyond year 10.
Sure.
So they use the Gordon growth model to stabilize the math so the spreadsheet doesn't just break. Are they really making a metaphysical claim about infinity? Or are they just trying to finish the spreadsheet so they can go to lunch?
That tension right there is exactly why Takasugi's analysis is so vital.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your pushback highlights the exact mechanism of the trap.
What do you mean?
It is precisely because the junior analyst just wants to use a functional placeholder and go to lunch that the ontological corruption takes root. The analyst inputs the perpetual growth rate casually. They know it's a necessary fiction.
Right, they know they're just plugging a hole.
But as that single net present value number travels up the corporate hierarchy, from the analyst to the VP, from the VP to the CFO, and finally to the board of directors, all of those nuanced caveats, the probabilistic doubts, the awareness of Nietzschean uncertainty, it all gets stripped away.
The number hardens as it ascends the ladder.
Yes. By the time it reaches the boardroom, a Tuesday afternoon placeholder assumption has metamorphosed into a cold, hard, empirical fact.
And then they take a fundamentally unknowable future, slap a precise number on it, and make billion-dollar allocation decisions as if that number is a discovered law of physics, not a guess someone made before lunch.
Exactly. The epistemic overreach isn't born from malice. It is a structural byproduct of an institution demanding certainty where none can possibly exist.
Man, if you're listening to this and you've ever felt that visceral pit in your stomach during a Q3 forecasting meeting or felt a sense of dread when reviewing a project's metrics, Takasugi is giving you the clinical vocabulary for what's actually happening.
He really is. The math isn't just sitting passively on a screen. It's actively dictating organizational behavior.
So what does this actually do to the people working inside these organizations? We've established how the math works and how it shapes perception, But how does Takasugi map the human cost of this sedimentation?
Well, he argues that when an organization is fully sedimented in must mode, the failure to meet a mathematical target undergoes a profound translation in the human mind.
Translation how?
So the statement, the NPV of this initiative is lower than our hurdle rate, no longer means our constructed model produced a suboptimal output.
What does it mean then?
It translates directly at a deep psychological level to, this initiative lacks objective value and therefore I have failed and my professional existence is a failure.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly heavy.
It is. And to systematize this, Takasugi introduces the RFC framework: reality, foreclosure, and conflict.
Okay, let's break down this RFC framework, because this directly mirrors the dysfunction we see in so many modern corporate environments. Let's start with R. If R stands for reality, how does the model distort what an organization perceives as real?
In the reality phase, the organization experiences chronic performance anxiety because the output of the DCF model completely displaces ground truth reality.
Ground truth reality being like actual happy customers.
Yes, even if a business division has strong customer retention, excellent employee morale, healthy margins, a failure to meet the specific aggressive growth rate demanded by the DCF model is perceived as an existential crisis. The model's target becomes the only reality that matters.
Which means the organization's threat response is entirely oriented around an abstract metric rather than physical operational health. If the spreadsheet says you are failing, the entire corporate apparatus panics, regardless of what is actually happening on the factory floor.
Exactly, and that panic accelerates the organization into the F phase, foreclosure.
Foreclosure, how does that manifest operationally?
As severe short-termism. The perceptual horizon of the entire executive suite violently contracts.
Because they're panicking about the immediate target.
Right, because the DCF model mathematically devalues the long-term anyway, and the organization is panicking over missing a short-term target. Long-term strategic damage simply ceases to register as a threat.
The perceptual frame just excludes it. Like, if a CEO slashes the customer service budget by 40%, the current year's free cash flow spikes, right?
The numbers look great today.
The DCF model registers a massive increase in value. But the fact that brand equity will disintegrate and churn will skyrocket in year 6 doesn't impact the immediate decision, because year 6 is heavily discounted and lies beyond the immediate perceptual horizon.
The feedback loop becomes entirely self-sealing, and that inevitable divergence between the model's demands and operational reality triggers the final phase, C, conflict.
So what happens in the conflict phase?
This is the stage of massive behavioral and strategic distortions. The organization implicitly demands that operational reality must comply with the mathematical model.
But reality is messy. It rarely complies with exponential growth curves on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. So when reality fails to meet the model, the practitioners realize they have to force the numbers to match.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like grading a student on a curve that doesn't actually exist, and then acting surprised when they start cheating on the test just to survive the system.
That's a brilliant analogy. This is the root cause of earnings management, channel stuffing, deferred maintenance, hiding systemic risks.
Manipulating things to survive the grading process.
Right. And Takasugi is explicitly clear that these behaviors should not be dismissed merely as the actions of a few random bad apples or some moral failure.
They are systemic.
Yes, they are highly predictable, systemic, rational responses of practitioners trapped in the conflict register of a must-mode organization. When the institution eliminates the capacity to perceive anything outside the confines of the model, manipulating reality to fit the model becomes the only viable survival strategy.
That is deeply unsettling. But, Takasugi's thesis pushes even further than cognitive bias or institutional incentives, doesn't it? He argues that this must-mode ontology physically invades the human body.
Yes, this is where the paper takes a truly revolutionary turn. This is where Takasugi bridges financial theory and human biology.
Biology, like actual physiological responses.
Yes. He utilizes a 9-layer model of human experience. Now, traditional corporate management theory focuses almost exclusively on layers 4 through 7.
Which are what, exactly?
Those are the layers governing conscious beliefs, narrative self-understanding, analytical evaluation, the thinking layers. When a company tries to fix its culture, it targets these upper layers with, new mission statements, offsite retreats, directives to think outside the box.
But if you only target conscious cognition, you are completely ignoring the biological hardware that actually dictates human behavior under stress.
Exactly. So what are the foundational layers Takasugi points to? He focuses our attention on layer 1, which involves precognitive somatic patterning.
Somatic patterning.
It's the physical way a body holds tension before a conscious thought is even fully formed. And fundamentally, he focuses on layer 0, the state of the autonomic nervous system.
Okay, wait. Let me make sure I'm mapping this correctly, because bridging corporate finance with neurobiology is a massive leap.
It is, but bear with me. He draws heavily on polyzagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, to explain how organizations paralyze themselves.
Right, polyvagal theory essentially maps how our autonomic nervous system shifts between states of safety, fight or flight, and freeze, right?
Yes, exactly.
And this is governed by neuroception, our nervous system's subconscious continuous surveillance of the environment for threats. But how does a socially constructed metric like a missed NPV target on a laptop screen cross the blood-brain barrier to trigger an actual autonomic threat response?
It bridges that gap because within a fully sedimented capitalist ontology, professional status and economic security are functionally equivalent to physical survival.
Oh, because your livelihood is tied to it.
Right. When a practitioner operates in a must-mode environment, their neuroception is completely calibrated to the model.
So when a quarterly projection comes in below the required DCF target,
The body does not process this as an interesting mathematical puzzle to be solved. The autonomic nervous system interprets it as an immediate, severe threat to survival.
this is mind-blowing. Are we saying that missing a DCF target literally triggers the exact same physical fight or flight response as being chased by a predator in the wild?
Yes, exactly. And this raises an important question. What happens to the brain in that state? Here is the catastrophic implication for organizational problem solving. When the sympathetic nervous system activates fight or flight, the physiological system responsible for social engagement, open communication, and creative lateral thinking literally shuts down.
The brain just turns off the creativity switch.
Yes, the biological hardware required to engage in want mode exploration, the ability to hold multiple scenarios, to brainstorm, to innovate, becomes structurally unavailable to the brain.
This completely upends how we view corporate dysfunction. If an executive team walks into a boardroom to discuss a missed revenue target and their autonomic nervous systems are already flooded with cortisol,
Telling them to innovate or pivot is biologically futile. You are asking them to perform a cognitive task that their nervous system has locked them out of.
you cannot cognitive reframe your way out of a nervous system threat response. If the boardroom is physiologically in fight or flight before the meeting even starts, cognitive reframing is totally useless.
Exactly. If the biological substrate is screaming that survival is tied to hitting a singular number, upper layer management directives to hold the model lightly are just words. You have to address layer 0 first. You must regulate the nervous system of the organization before you can effectively shift the financial strategy.
Wow. Okay, so if we are biologically and institutionally trapped by this formula, how do we systematically escape it? Because we obviously can't just throw the math away. Businesses require frameworks to allocate capital.
Right, we can't just stop planning for the future.
So how do we de-sediment the model and return to a functional, pluralistic approach?
Takasugi argues for a rigorous, methodical return to what he calls a want mode reading of DCF. Like you said, this isn't about discarding the math. It's about fundamentally altering our relationship to it. He outlines 3 mandatory commitments.
Okay, what's the first commitment?
First is explicit model consciousness.
Amen.
Practitioners must institutionalize the recognition that DCF is a constructed tool, not an empirical measurement. Its outputs are the results of human choices, not discoveries of objective truth. Knowing it's a decision, not a discovery.
That requires breaking the sedimentation. Okay, what's the second commitment?
Deliberate scenario plurality. Instead of allowing a presentation to converge on a single net present value, organizations must structurally mandate the exploration of a distribution of possible futures.
Valuing the distribution itself, keeping the futures open.
Yes, you must actively defend the openness of the future against the institutional pressure to collapse it.
And the third?
The third commitment is temporal structure awareness. Practitioners must remain continuously aware that applying a discount rate is a philosophical, ontological choice about the value of time. It is not an inevitable law of nature.
Intellectually, those 3 commitments make perfect sense. But practically, maintaining that stance while operating inside a hyper-competitive must-mode environment sounds utterly exhausting.
It is incredibly hard.
It's the equivalent of trying to continuously remind yourself that gravity is just a theory while you're currently falling out of a plane.
That is a very apt description. Must mode provides the comfort of certainty, even if it's a false certainty. want mode is hard, which is precisely why Takasugi introduces the foundational prerequisite for sustaining a want mode orientation.
Which is?
He calls it cognitive elasticity, or in Japanese, Nichiteki Danryakusei. He illustrates this concept using the metallurgy of a shape memory alloy.
Oh, I love the shape memory alloy analogy. Let's break that down. A shape memory alloy can undergo immense physical stress and deform, but once the stressor is removed or heat is applied, it returns to its original engineered shape.
Right, it possesses a structural memory. It doesn't fracture, and it doesn't stay bent.
It represents the perfect middle ground between two pathological extremes.
Exactly. If an alloy is too rigid, sudden stress will cause it to fracture and shatter. In an organizational context, rigidity is the practitioner who completely denies reality when the market invalidates their financial model.
They just break.
Yes. Conversely, if an alloy is entirely plastic, stress will permanently warp it. That is the practitioner who collapses into panic and totally abandons their strategic vision at the first sign of a missed target.
But cognitive elasticity allows the practitioner to absorb the shock of a terrible quarter or a catastrophic variance in the model without fracturing into denial or collapsing into total surrender. They can hold the tension of uncertainty.
They bend, but they return to shape.
But practically, for the listener who is sitting at their desk tomorrow morning, how do you practice cognitive elasticity when your boss is aggressively demanding a single certain number right now?
This is the missing piece in practitioner education. You cannot combat systemic must mode solely through individual psychological resilience.
You can't just meditate your way out of it.
Exactly. You have to introduce structural friction into the workflow that forces the organization to acknowledge plurality, even when it feels uncomfortable.
Structural friction, like what?
You change the architecture of the pitch book itself. You mandate that no strategic deck can be submitted with a single NPV. It must structurally include 3 distinct scenarios based on widely divergent macro assumptions.
So you literally refuse to give them just one number.
Right. You alter the institutional vocabulary. When pressured for the number, the elastic practitioner responds, given these specific variables, the probability distribution suggests a range between X and Y. It is a methodical procedural resistance against the organizational gravity that pulls toward false certainty.
You are essentially engineering speed bumps into the corporate infrastructure to prevent the autonomic nervous system from accelerating into a false sense of security. It forces the prefrontal cortex to stay engaged.
Exactly it.
When we look at the sheer scale of what Takasugi is proposing, it feels like it answers a question that sociologists and critical theorists have been circling for decades. How does this paper position itself within the broader literature?
To truly appreciate Takasugi's work, we have to synthesize it with the major sociological frameworks of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. For context, we can look at the foundational work of scholars like George Frankfurter and Elton McGowan.
Right. They demonstrated that financial economics basically operates as an ideology. It presents itself as an objective, value-neutral science, but it actually enforces a highly specific market fundamentalist worldview.
Exactly. But Frankfurter and McGowan identified the ideology mostly at the macro level.
They pointed out that the water was ideological, but they didn't necessarily explain the specific plumbing of how it gets into the drinking supply.
That's a great way to put it. Then you have Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism, which argues that capitalism has so seamlessly colonized our cultural imagination that it has become nearly impossible to envision a coherent alternative.
We are trapped in a cultural must mode, where the current system is perceived not as a choice, but as the only realistic state of nature.
Right. But Fisher's lens is primarily cultural and aesthetic. And if we look at someone like Pierre Bourdieu in his theory of habitus, which is critical here, Bourdieu explains how social structures reproduce themselves through the unconscious embodied dispositions of individuals.
Right. A junior banker doesn't consciously decide to enforce capitalist realism. Their habitus, their deeply ingrained professional reflexes, how they talk, what they value, what they fear, does it for them.
And that is precisely where Takasugi's unique monumental contribution lies. We have this Mount Rushmore of theorists, Fisher, Bourdieu, Anthony Giddens, who have expertly described the culture of foreclosure, the aesthetic of capitalism, the sociological tendencies of reproduction.
But they explain the culture or the tendencies.
Yes, exactly. Takasugi provides the exact formal mathematical mechanism. He identifies the DCF formula as the specific operational gear that translates the macro ideology of capitalism into the microhabitus of the individual practitioner.
It's like previous thinkers realized the house was locked from the outside, but Takasugi is showing us the exact blueprint of the lock and the math of the deadbolt.
I completely agree with that analogy, and because he illuminates the exact mechanism, he simultaneously reveals the method of unlocking it.
Right.
Seeing the model as a model isn't just a technical refinement for financial analysts. As Takasugi states, it is an existential act. By structurally refusing to allow a mathematical compression mechanism to dictate the boundaries of the real, the practitioner reclaims their agency.
An existential act enacted within an Excel spreadsheet. I love that. We have traversed an incredible amount of intellectual territory today. We started by simply asking how to value a hypothetical coffee shop, and we ended up uncovering how a ubiquitous financial formula acts as a mechanism of ontological foreclosure.
It really escalates quickly.
It does. We explored how the mathematical requirement to discount the future and calculate infinity triggers actual biological fight-or-flight responses. It creates chronic organizational anxiety and structurally erases our ability to imagine alternative futures.
It serves as a profound warning about the instruments we build. We construct models to help us measure and navigate the complexity of the world. But if we lose our cognitive elasticity, if we allow those models to sediment into unquestioned truths, the models will inevitably rebuild us and our organizations in their own rigid image.
For you listening to this, the implications extend far beyond the realm of corporate finance or investment banking. Even if you have never built a DCF model in your life, you inhabit systems that are entirely governed by these exact mathematical constraints.
Oh, absolutely.
The corporations whose products you rely on, the platforms that moderate your digital life, the institutions you work for, they are all breathing the same must-mode oxygen. The challenge for all of us is to actively maintain cognitive elasticity in a world that relentlessly demands rigid certainty.
The ultimate objective is to preserve the plural possibilities of the future, resisting the profound institutional and physiological pressures that seek to collapse it.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to examine in your own life. We spent this deep dive dissecting the metrics of corporate finance, but I encourage you to turn that exact same analytical lens onto the personal metrics that govern your daily existence.
That's a really good point.
Think about your credit score. Consider the fitness tracker algorithm that dictates your physical activity, or the productivity software that monitors your efficiency at work. Are these everyday tools performing their own localized version of ontological foreclosure on your personal future?
Are you existing within a must-mode simulation of your own life? Simply because you have subconsciously surrendered the definition of your reality to a number on a screen.
Right. If your sleep tracker tells you that your recovery was poor, do you physically manifest fatigue even if you woke up feeling completely restored? What other numerical metrics have sedimented into absolute truths in your life? And what possible futures are they currently erasing?
The underlying mechanism of foreclosure remains identical. It is merely operating on a different dashboard.
The architecture of the trap is exactly the same. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Question your metrics, maintain your elasticity, and keep your futures strictly plural. We will see you next time.